So, welcome everyone. I am Katharina Heiden and I greet you from Switzerland, where it is late afternoon now. I'm a professor for ancient history of Christianity and interreligious encounters at the University of Bern. And together with my colleague David Nierenberg, the director, and Leon Levy, professor at the Institute for Advanced Studies, Princeton, I lead the research project Interactive Histories, Co-Produced Communities, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. This is the first open Zoom seminar of our initiative, and we are sincerely thrilled to see all of you here, colleagues, friends, and faces, or just names, still unknown, from different continents, time zones, different academic disciplines and cultures. It's really great to have all of you with us. Before we launch into what promises to be an engaging lecture and discussion with Orit, Malka, and Rushain Abbasi about witnessing in the Quran, I would like to say just a few words about the idea of co-produced religions, the idea that inspires our work here and the goal of our project. It is hardly innovative to claim that Islam, Judaism, and Christianity share a common scriptural tradition and a common history, and that those religions are therefore interrelated and intertwined. I think most people would affirm the interconnected historical lineages of these three religious traditions. Both within academy and beyond, interactions between the three religious cultures are very much the focus of recent attention. And yet, as scholars, religious leaders, believers, and secular citizens, we still tend to tell the stories of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism as if they were largely independent of the others. We are accustomed to viewing and presenting the histories of these three religious communities and traditions separately, and to claim their paths as linear and straightforward manners of what some call religious identity building. Our project aims to tell a different story. We aim to tell the history of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity as one of co-produced traditions. What do we mean by this? These religious traditions and communities are co-produced in the sense that they are continuously forming, reforming, and transforming themselves by interacting with or just imagining one another without real interaction. And this ongoing co-productive transformation affects all dimensions of religion: its rituals, laws, liturgies, narratives, teachings, symbols, holy sites, role models and heroes, hermeneutics, philosophies, theologies. But such co-production also goes beyond the religious communities themselves. It also affects our most basic ideals, our prejudices about each other, and also the conceptual tools we use to understand and research religions and history, both in academia and public discourse. To be clear, religious co-production does not necessarily imply peaceful attitudes or actions toward other traditions or interpretations. On the contrary, religious co-production, as we understand it, is deeply ambivalent. Throughout history, the ongoing co-productive dynamics between Jews, Christians, and Muslims have produced the possibilities of both peaceful coexistence and destructive violence, of cultural appropriation, several supersessionisms, as well as tolerance and admiration for each other, possibilities of symbiosis and separation, of stigmatization, segregation, and even extermination. With regard to the history of ideas, as a theologian, I am myself always stunned to see how the most powerful, sublime, and the most beautiful interpretations of scriptures and the most beautiful theological thoughts of one of the three traditions, when viewed from the perspective of the other, or if you wish, when viewed through the lenses of co-production, also reveal their most abysmal and destructive potentials. We intend to explore moments in history from which we can understand better how religious co-production worked in the past, what it entailed, and the myriad potentials and challenges such co-production poses for the present and future. Together with our 7 postdoctoral researchers and 13 academic collegium members, we seek to produce our own scholarship on particularly significant moments of co-production in the history of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. But we also aspire to create a network of people who share the same interests and questions, and our public Zoom seminars is a first step toward meeting that objective. So we are very happy that you accepted our invitation to this first seminar. And we hope as well that this is the beginning of a fruitful and robust exchange. And with that, I pass on to David Nierenberg in Princeton.
I have very little to say except to second everything Katarina said, especially to welcome you. This is our first Zoom seminar. There will be one per month. And I just want to say a word about how our first came to be Rushain Abbasi and Orit Malka, and neither of whom I've met. But I was told about their work. I was invited to participate in a workshop they were doing at the Yale Law School, and my enormous sadness at not being able to participate on a project that is so obviously relevant to what we're doing led me to hazard asking them to join us for our first. And I mentioned that story just because I want to invite all of you, if you hear of work that you think is highly relevant to the kinds of approaches that we're trying to do here, to just let us know. We will be having one open seminar per month for the next 2 years, and we really want to create a space in which all of us who are interested in this very old, very broad, very general question of great importance, I think, to the possibilities of life and to the interpretations of the past that structure the possibilities of life for many of us. Please, we want to create a space for participation. So please don't hesitate to share awareness of this seminar. This is open Zoom seminar, to suggest people you'd like to see perhaps participate, and to spread the news with like-minded friends or interested colleagues. And with that, I would like to ask Shlomo Zukier to introduce our wonderful speakers, whose paper I think you will agree is a perfect example with which to open an inquiry into how fundamental concepts in the history of religions are co-produced. Shlomo.
Okay, thank you, Katarina and David, and welcome everyone. And thank you all for joining the opening public seminar of the Interactive Histories Co-Produced Communities, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam project, and particularly for the paper today entitled The Concept of Witnessing in the Quran and its Biblical Subtext. As David mentioned, I'm Shlomo Zukier, one of the postdocs taking part in this overall project, and I'm very happy to be the facilitator for our seminar today, which features presenters Orit Malka and Rushain Abbasi. You should all have received and hopefully even read their paper, and I'll introduce Orit and Rushain, then they'll offer a short presentation on their paper and process. We'll then have an extended question and answer session where I'll start off with a few questions and then open it up to the crowd. So introducing our speakers. Orit Malka is a member of the faculty of the law school and the Talmud department at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She earned her PhD from Tel Aviv University and was previously a postdoctoral fellow in the Taub Center for Jewish Studies at Stanford University and at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. Rushain Abbasi is a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the humanities and lecturer in the Department of Religious Studies at Stanford University. You'll notice the recurring theme of Stanford, I believe the site of the co-production of this paper and its research. Rushain received his PhD from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University in 2021, where his dissertation was awarded the prestigious Al-Walid bin Talal Prize for Best Dissertation in Islamic Studies. He formerly served as an associate research scholar at the Abdullah Kamal Institute for Islamic Law and Civilization at Yale Law School. Orit and Rushain.
All right, thank you. I'll just begin by outlining a little bit of what we'll be doing today. First off, I'd just like to say thank you to David, Katerina for the invitation, Shlomo for facilitating all of this. We're really, really excited. I think there's no better place for us to present our work, which we've been sitting on, we believe, this sort of treasure for so long, trying to develop it. And it's like sort of presenting it to the world now. So I think this is the perfect place to be doing it. Today, I think I just want to first say that it will be something of an unorthodox presentation. It won't be a full-fledged lecture, given that we've already pre-circulated the paper, and I hope you've had time to read it. And even if you haven't, please take the time to do so in the coming weeks. We'd love to hear your feedback. So what we'll do, given the setting of our presentation, is talk a little bit about our collaborative process. I think it's just a fascinating experience I think we've both undergone, and I think it'd be nice for us to share a little bit about how it's been for us, the kind of learning process we've gone through as scholars of respectively Islamic and Jewish studies. Then I will begin outlining a little bit of the problem that we encountered that we're seeking to address in our paper and our broader project about the concept of bearing witness in the Quran. To which Orit will then proceed to give a little bit more of the flesh of our argument, speaking about the Quran's engagement with rabbinic covenantal thought, and also this really astounding parallel literary formula that we find in some biblical and post-biblical texts that the Quran seems to adopt. And then what we'll do is speak a little bit about part 2 of our article, which we haven't completed yet, but we have essentially a broad sense of what's going on, and we find it to be a complementary aspect of the broader mechanism of oath-taking and witnessing in the Quran that we're arguing for. And we'll close with that and then open it up to questions. So hopefully that sounds good to you all. And I think I'll just begin talking a little bit about my aspect of the experience, and then I'll hand it over to Orit, and yeah, we'll start with there. So yeah, the first thing I'll say is I think that our work is a co-religious production in the double sense. Not only that we're working on a subject matter in which we argue for the deeply intertwined nature of various scriptural texts, specifically in this case from the Jewish and the Islamic traditions, but also that we ourselves inhabit those distinct traditions, both as scholars, but also people who have lived within those traditions their entire lives. So it's been a really fascinating experience embarking on this inquiry of co-production through a co-production in and of itself. So I just wanted to say a little bit about that, just because I think it will be a nice way to start off the reflection and thinking about what it means to engage in this sort of inquiry in this day and age. And the first thing I'll just note on a more biographical note is that I wasn't even a Quranic studies scholar to begin with. So I think I'm in a very unique position of first diving into the world of Quranic studies in a concrete sense of doing this sort of intertextual inter-Quranic work with the help and assistance of a Talmudic and rabbinic scholar. And I think I'm in a very unique position in that sense. I actually trained as a medievalist, but I had been increasingly interested in the late antique world and the world of the Quran. And Orit had come to me with some ideas that she wasn't really sure about. And when she had presented it to me, I thought about all of these resonances in the Quran, and we quickly realized that there was something here to work with. I just wanted to say a little bit about what I've learned through that process. beyond simply becoming Orit's close friend and learning about the Jewish tradition and the many holidays that have taken place over the past month. And so it's been an exciting personal experience of learning about Judaism, both in a scholarly and a lay sense. But also just three main points about something that I think is relevant to our broader interest as scholars who are looking at co-produced religions. The first thing that I'll say is that one of the valuable aspects of our experience working as experts within our own respective fields, right? And really, even if Orit begins to study Arabic, I begin to study Hebrew, we'll never be able to attain that sort of expertise that each of us have in our respective fields. One of the really astounding things of our collaboration is that because we're so deeply rooted in our different traditions, whether through our philological expertise in Arabic and Hebrew and other languages, or just a deep familiarity with the commentarial traditions, is that we were able to pick up on very deep resonances between these traditions. And I think that's one of the aspects of our project that we'll try to highlight, is that we're not talking about a very surface level borrowing of various texts. We're talking about a deep understanding of biblical thought, of rabbinic covenantal thought that seems to permeate through the entirety of the Quran. And I think it really came about through this back and forth, right? So she would talk a little bit about some verse from Deuteronomy, and I'd say, okay, this makes sense. I hear this in the Quran resonating. And the same in the other way, we'd read a verse and she'd say, look, this is right there. So we really came to believe in the deeply intertextual nature of this of these scriptures and other texts. So it's not simply a search for a transmission, but rather an understanding of the conceptual, deeply conceptually intertwined language of these scriptures. And pursuant to that point, one thing that I had come out learning from this experience was what one might call the deeply midrashic nature of the Quran. And this is something we've sort of developed in tandem, and I'm very persuaded by it now, given what we've encountered over and over again. So at one level, we can speak of intertextual tools, right, of trying to understand scriptural hermeneutics. But at another level, I think we're beginning to understand the quote unquote updated nature of the Quran, right? So we commonly know that the Quran itself professes that it's sort of updating these older scriptures and older theologies. But that's often been understood in a very generic sense. And what I think we're able to do through this project, and we hope any other projects will continue to do so, and I'm sure much has already been done, is that we move from the generic to the very specific, right? That we're seeing at the mundane level of terminology, of vocabulary that's sparse throughout the Quran. We see that that process of updating, that process of commentary, in almost a midrashic sense, right, of resolving theological problems from within the Jewish tradition or other traditions. So that's been a really fascinating experience of ours, and I think we will be continuing this in the future in part 2 and perhaps in other projects. And the last thing I'll say is that, and I think we'll speak about it more when we present our findings, is that because we're so deeply rooted in these traditions and we're seeing these deep resonances, we've sort of moved to a very textual and conceptual focus, right? So we're less interested in the question of transmission, which is of course an important question, but ours is an investigation that is, I think, deeply rooted in the question of what we might call the polemical construction of theology, right? So we're looking at the content and the substance of how the Quran elaborates its theology in conversation with the Jewish tradition. And in doing so, we're able to unravel the various concepts of the Quran in greater depth. And I'll talk about this when I talk about the introduction of the Shahada, obviously a central concept in the Quran. But our argument is really that you can't understand it without reference to this broader tradition. And that it brings very covert aspects of this theology to light, those that have been missed by the classical tradition, but also modern scholarship. So these are just little tidbits of things I've learned, a little bit about the personal experience that I've undergone. I think I can say without exaggeration that it's probably been the most intellectually stimulating activity that I've done, and that I think we should really encourage this kind of collaborative work. I think we, as humanities scholars, are really isolated, right? You see in the hard sciences, there are 6, 7, 8 co-authors on a paper, right? I don't know how they manage that. I mean, 2 is enough for us, and I think we had to deal with so much back and forth and how to even write a paper, given our different styles. But I just think that this is really the way forward. And yeah, I'm so thankful that we serendipitously came across each other at Stanford, and that Orit presented these amazing thoughts of hers, and we were able to develop it. So yeah, my thanks to Orit, and then also to all of you for joining us. And I'll leave it to Orit now to introduce her side of the story.
Thank you, Rushain, and thank you, everybody. It's very exciting to be with you and to present this paper for the first time live to an audience. I too have to second everything Rushain said. It was a very, very exciting project. We ran across each other when I was a postdoc at Stanford. Now I'm back in Jerusalem. And actually, with the help of a friend and colleague who's now with us, Omer Michaelis, who has known the work of both of us. And he told me, you know, there's this guy, Rushain. I never met him in person, but his work is amazing. You have to go meet him. And that's how I just approached Rushain. And I told him, hey, I want to show you something, an idea. Maybe it would be interesting to you, and maybe we can talk about it. And it was just really out of the blue that I came to his life with this idea. And it was really fascinating to find someone who is so open to this conversation and to this collaboration. And for me, I'm a scholar of Talmudic literature, Talmudic law, and I started my research on the idea of testimony in rabbinic law. So maybe some of you know, it's a very, very complicated concept for the rabbis. They have so many very strange laws regarding testimony, and it's been a hermeneutical problem that's been bothering lawyers and commentators alike for many, you can say for 2,000 years, really. And so I come from my training is in law, and I'm a lawyer by training, basically. So I came from the legal aspect of it. And as I started working on it, I realized, I discovered there was a whole dimension of testimony and the role of witnesses that was very, very deeply rooted in the idea of oaths, taking an oath, swearing, which is something that scholars generally overlook. Generally, we think of witnesses as like this rational means of evidence, of proof. People come forward and say what they know, as opposed to more religious types of proofs that come, like the oath, which is a religious type of proof. So these two worlds are studied separately. Different works, different scholars deal with the two of them, and they're really, very few people are aware of the deep connection between the two, which I think I found. And I in my PhD, I have suggested some kind of a reconstruction of the ancient connection between oath and testimony in the Bible. And then it occurred to me that the Quran has some very fascinating parallels to very unique features of rabbinic laws of testimony. For example, the idea that a woman's testimony is worth half of a man's testimony. This idea that we find in the Quran is also found very uniquely in the Tosefta. And it struck me that it can't be coincidental. Something there is very deep, something there is very similar. And I started looking at the Quran, and I saw all these many references to witnesses. And like Rushain said, it looked familiar. I felt, hey, I have a sense of what's going on here, and it's not what everybody else thinks. And that's how I started thinking about testimony in the Quran. But of course, I couldn't make any progress with this thought before I started the collaboration with Rushain, and when we started working on this together. And as for co-produced communities, so how did we start off? After we just presented the ideas and started, changing ideas about that, we started a chavruta, which, as some of you may know, is a very Jewish way of studying. We've collected all the sources that we need to look at, and we sat with each other for hours on hours, I think maybe 50 hours of sitting together on the sources and studying them in tandem and bringing up all the associations, you know, like the way that Jews do that. And we did it through last year, and some of it was during the Ramadan. So Rushain was fasting, and so the more the days, the more advanced we were in the days of the Ramadan, he was weaker. We couldn't study as often as we wanted. So we too felt, like Rushain mentioned before, there was just the holidays for the Jews. So we felt each other's tradition in a very intimate way, and that was a very, very special experience for me as well. Okay, now I think we can move on to present the ideas themselves.
Yes, okay, let's do it. Okay, so I'll begin by presenting the problem, so to speak. And it's not really much of a problem because the problem itself wasn't really recognized and problematized in the first instance. And so we do think we're raising a novel question and trying to resolve it given its centrality. So the problem is the appearance of this small root, shahada, throughout the Quran. And it's not one of little significance. Of course, it appears around 160 times throughout the Quran, but it develops increasing significance given that it exemplifies what we might call the essential principle of the faith, the shahada, right? So what has been variously called the testimony or the declaration of faith, that you say, I bear witness that there is no God but God, and that Muhammad is the messenger of God. Historically speaking, it occurs from a very early period. It's in the ritual prayer, which we know was a practice from an early period. We find it in inscriptions by lay believers who are simply attesting their faith, because it is the declaration you make to enter into the faith. It's this tricky phrase here, I bear witness. And we're interested, and first when Orit had proposed the question to me, that was the first thing that I had recognized. Well, what do we really mean when you say you bear witness that there is no God but God? It's simply been taken for granted that it's something like I declare, or I believe, or something. But we wanted to understand through the Quran and its wide use of this terminology, what's really going on. So it has this very central place, but it's very little understood, and for a variety of reasons. So like Orit mentioned, the use of the term witnessing is frequently invoked in a legal context in the Quran. And I could probably say that there's an overwhelmingly legal bias in the approach to Islam and also the Quran. There's this idea that Muslims aren't really a theological tradition like Christianity, but more of a legal tradition, but not really as much as the Jews, right? It's sort of in the middle. But these biases really preclude us from understanding these traditions properly. And we realize very quickly that the legal invocations of witnessing are very few and far between, and that in fact, shahida is used in a variety of really important theological contexts, whether with reference to the covenant or not, and that there hasn't really been an attempt to understand what's going on here, first at a philological level, but then also the theological significance that's attached to it. So for example, in the classical tafsir tradition, when you have the use of shahida, or yashhadu, kanu shuhada alay, they were witnesses to something, there really isn't much commentary on the use of that particular term. Oftentimes, classical commentators in the medieval tradition will say, oh, it's equivalent to saying, oh, he knows something or he observes something, right? For example, there's one verse in the Quran which says, know that there is no God but Allah, fa'alam annahu la ilaha illallah, right? And so people would say, oh, that's really equivalent to the shahada, right? Because the shahada doesn't appear in its full elaboration in the Quran, but there are various glimpses of it, which we'll talk about a little bit. So in the classical tradition, not much is made of this usage of shahida, with very minor exceptions, which I'll speak about. And then in modern scholarship, there really hasn't been a systematic work on the idea of bearing witness. There have been some very valuable encyclopedic articles. There have been tangential investigations in the course of other inquiries. And what we realized is actually that a lot of these scholars are recognizing very important elements associated with the term shahida, right? That it seems to signify some kind of loyalty, some type of deep commitment, various resonances throughout the Quran, which, the aggregate of which we think amounts to essentially what we're outlining. So in a sense, ours isn't a sort of radical break from contemporary scholarship. What it's really trying to do is bring it together in a systematic way and try to make sense of it in light of its biblical subtext, which seems to be very clearly engaged in this context. So really what we're providing is a systematic framework for its understanding. So that's one element, right? And I think it's really the central element. It's a very deeply philological investigation. And like Orit said, we looked at all of the instances and kept going back to the verses, tried to connect them to other verses, a very long, tedious process, but one which I think was very fruitful by the end of it, because we saw the connections inter-Quranically, but also intertextually with these other biblical and post-biblical and rabbinic texts. So we'll talk a little bit about what we discovered in our understanding of what shahida signifies. And it really comes back to Orit's contention about the taking of oaths, right? Which has a deep significance in the ancient context, but which we argue carries over very naturally into the late antique and into the Quranic world, both at a sort of lay conceptual level, but also at a deeper theological, polemical level, which the Quran picks up on. And then the other element, just to by way of introduction, is that of covenantal studies. And I think that's the more developed subfield within Islamic studies, because there is reference to various taking of oaths in the Jewish context and also seemingly outside. So we have mundane treatises which use this term mithaq and ahd, but they're also used in a more sacred sense with reference, for example, to the Israelites. And so there's been a lot of discussion around that from the early mid 20th century. Some German scholars have spoken about this, to Wansborough's work, and more recently there's been development in the past couple of decades speaking about the Quran's engagement with the biblical covenant. And I think we could say that overall the consensus now is that there is some engagement with the biblical covenant, but it's really scattered references, and it doesn't amount to a systematic engagement with the idea. So one of the more recent, there are two recent scholarly inquiries, one of which argues that it's actually not a deep engagement at all, and it's actually a very surface level borrowing of the biblical covenantal idea. Others will not accept that idea, and they'll say, well, it's actually a developed polemical tool. But again, there is no a recognition of a kind of systematic, coherent nature, which we're trying to argue. And I would say the way in which we're presenting that argument is to say we need to broaden the covenantal theological lexicon, right? So people have focused on these scattered terms like mithaq and ahad, which don't appear that frequently and are used in different senses. But we're saying, well, there are other terms attached to the covenant and the idea of oath-taking, right? And here, shahida is very relevant. We find it throughout the various surahs from the Meccan to the Medinan period. We find it used at very important instances associated with the covenant. But again, even the most recent interventions in the field of covenantal theology in Islam have not included shahida and the bearing of witness as one of the part and parcel of this broader lexicon. So we're actually saying this is actually a key to better understanding what's going on with the covenant, how the Quran understands the covenant, and is trying to update that covenant. We'll move on to the biblical context, but first I'll say a little bit about the Quranic context. And this helps us in many ways. So first of all, it shows us that the Quran itself recognizes the equation of this term shahada and bearing witness with the taking of oaths, right? So as you'll see in our paper, in the chapter of light, Surah An-Nur, chapter 24, which is a very legalistic chapter, which talks about various penal laws associated with adultery, for example. In the verses 6 to 8, there is this idea that when you don't have a witness for adultery, you can take an oath 4 times, and on the 5th, invoke the curse of God. And then the wife in response can also take 4 oaths, right? Tashhada arba shahadat billah, right? And the word used here is that of testimony. But what all translators understand and what all classical commentaries understand is that really what they're saying is swearing oaths, right? The idea is that there is no witness present. So they can swear 4 oaths that, yes, indeed, she has committed adultery, and she can say in response, no, I have not, and he's a liar, right? So here we already have the idea that shahada is really being used in the sense of an oath, right? And here there's another relevant chapter here from the chapter 63, Surat al-Munafiqun, the chapter of the hypocrites, a short, much shorter chapter, around 11 verses. And in the first 2 verses, of the whole chapter is about the hypocrites of the Medinan community, of Muhammad's community in Medina. And here it says that God testifies, he bears witness that the munafiqun, the hypocrites, are liars when they take testimony and say, no, we believe in Muhammad, right? Or we bear witness that Muhammad is a messenger. God bears witness against them. And in the second verse, it says, ittakhadha aymanuhum, right? They have taken their oaths junnatan as a cover. So they're sort of disguising themselves with this oath. So here, ayman, yamin is an oath in the classical Arabic. It sometimes signifies these pacts, these oath pacts, which are taken in pre-Islamic Arabian society. So here there's a clear equation again of the taking of testimony of shahada with an ayman, right? And actually, in some of the commentaries, only a few commentaries, they recognize this point. And I think they really only recognize this point here because there's a very direct hermeneutical problem, right? It says God bears witness, and then it says their oaths. Well, what's happening here? So someone like Zamakhshari will say, a very canonical classic commentator will say, oh, it really means to, when you say ashhada, I bear witness, it can also mean ahlaf, right? That I take an oath. And they'll attribute this understanding, this philological understanding, to Abu Hanifa and other authorities. So at different points in the Quran, there's this recognition to resolve very direct hermeneutical problems that there is this idea that when you bear witness, shahada, you actually are taking an oath. So that opens up the way for our understanding that the Quranic audience itself recognized the resonance between these terms at a very mundane level. But what it doesn't help us understand are the various theological invocations, which is really the center of our inquiry, right? And it's a far more developed and sophisticated understanding. And we believe that theological significance with direct reference to biblical covenantal theology can only be understood through this intertextual process of seeing how the Quran adopts various literary formulas from biblical, rabbinic, post-biblical texts. And this is where I will leave it now to Orit to explain a little bit about the Quran's engagement, very deep engagement with that rabbinic thought that helps us understand more clearly what's really going on in the theological development of the Shahada, right? Because then it becomes essentially the theological marker of Islam. So how does that come about? It comes about through this very close engagement with that rich tradition. So Orit, I'll let you speak now on this.
Yeah, thanks, Rushain. Yes, so just to start off, there is some very important simple fact about what an oath is that we need to take into account when thinking about this issue at all to begin with. Because when we read it in Surah, in chapter 24, we have no idea really. Why is it that when the woman takes an oath, they say she is testifying? How does this connection even begin? Well, in the background, there's the basic connection between oaths and witnesses, and it's one that it's not the one that we're arguing for. It's the classical notion that how do you even swear? How do you take an oath? You invoke God as a witness to your undertaking, to your statement. You're not saying, "Oh God, be my witness that I am committed to doing X and Y." This is basically the very basic structure of the oath. I call it the legal structure of the oath. Why? Because you commit yourself to doing something, and you also commit yourself to being punished if you violate your commitment. So it's the whole package. If I violate my oath, God, you will punish me. It also has an upside to it. If I fulfill my oath, God can reward me. And we will see that when we talk about part 2 of the project, where both aspects of punishment and reward will be relevant. But what we basically need to keep in mind is that every oath invokes basically the idea of witnesses. We have to have witnesses to the oath. So in many oath formulations, we're not given this explicit statement that there are witnesses there, or it's God that is a witness, or anything about witnesses. We have other verbs that are being used. But this is something very essential to the legal structure of every oath that's in the background, even when the words witness and testimony are not mentioned. Now, this usage that Rushain described, where saying about somebody, I am testifying, or I bear witness that X and Y means I take an oath. I just want to make very, very clear, this use does not exist in the Bible at all. Still, we argue, when the Quran makes use of this term, it does refer and builds upon biblical idea of oath taking. And how exactly does this come about? So there is one very central text. We will not have the time to go through all the texts that we discuss in the article. So I'll jump right to the end for those who didn't get the chance to get there. In the description of the covenant in Joshua 24, the covenant in Shechem, after the children of Israel have already entered the land of Israel, they fought a few wars, and they are in this occasion of a renewal of the covenant. And after a very ceremonial speech by Joshua about all the goods that God has done with the children of Israel, he is now inviting them to renew the covenant. And it's a very ceremonial piece there. He starts off by saying, well, will you accept God upon yourself? He does so in a provocative way, so telling them, I don't think you're able to take God upon yourselves because he's a jealous God. But anyway, it's just teasing them to say, will you do that? Will you accept God? And they say, yes, we will. And then he tells them, okay, then bear witness that something. So please be witnesses. He calls them be witnesses against yourself, maybe something like that. This is the common translation. And they say witnesses, or we are witnesses, or something like that. So in a very formulaic way, they approve their commitment. So, and this is a very, it's a 4-stage formula, that's how we call it. This question, will you take God upon yourself? The answer, yes. And then the invitation, well, bear witness. And the answer, we are witnesses. In the case of the Bible, this is, we can be sure this is an oath taking, both because of the structure of the covenant in general, but also because of specific interbiblical parallels. For example, one found in 1 Samuel, where the invocation of God as a witness is made in the context of an oath, and the similar formulaic answer, he is witness, reaffirms to us that this is an oath being taken. The striking thing is that in this very one specific unique case of Joshua 24, the witness to the oath is not God, but the people themselves. It's something like the people themselves being invoked as witnesses against each other, but no divine witnesses, which we find in this classical, what I described as classical oath structure. And just to make clear, the classical oath structure where gods are witnesses is found in all ancient cultures that I know of. Specifically, we have it in Akkadian texts, in Hittite texts, in Greek, in Latin, and the Quran itself also demonstrates this notion in the other verses. So it's a very, very broad and wide-ranging format. Being so broad and wide-ranging and basic to so many cultures, it goes through a lot of variations and plays on the formulations, etc., etc. And within this spectrum, this is the background that created this anomaly in Joshua 24, where the witnesses to the oath are not God, or not divine entities, or maybe natural forces like heaven and earth that are called as witnesses to the covenantal oath in Deuteronomy, for example, but rather the people themselves. But this creates something that becomes a big hit in the ancient world. So, taking an oath by saying, I am witness. And it picks, and later texts pick up on that. And one text that we cite in the article is from the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, from the Testament of Levi. We see here a reconstruction. This is a Christian text from the 2nd century, we see a reconstruction of the Joshua 24 covenantal event. And again, there, same four level structure. Will you accept God upon yourselves? Yes, we will. Well, then bear witness. And they answer, we are witnesses. This text is in Greek, but the format is just exactly the same. And when you go to the Quran, to verse 381, so there is a very clear covenantal context, although it's a covenant with the prophets, not the covenant with the people. But you will see that it follows the same structure. Will you accept what I am asking from you? Well, yes, we will. Well, then bear witness. So we see the same echo and the role of bearing witness that plays the same function in this structure that we find in the Quran. And so this is basically the way that we see in the Quran the resonance of this originally Jewish covenantal context that makes clear use of Jewish language, although it does so in a way that the Bible itself would never do. In Joshua 24, the people say we are witnesses, but they do that in the framework of the original idea of the covenant, where you invoke somebody else to be a witness to your own oath. In this case, the people invoke each other as witnesses against themselves. They don't say it's not that I am a witness to my own oath, but you are a witness to my oath and I'm a witness to your oath. It's still this mutual, the witness is not the person taking the oath. But in the later co-production, or however you want to call it, of the Quran, this idea has been taken to, and of course there are also some Christian traditions in the middle that we need to take into account, but we will not do that right now. But in a reworking of this biblical idea, this biblical template, saying I am witness now becomes synonym to say I am entering the covenant, I'm taking the covenantal oath upon myself. There's more to say about that, but you probably want to leave room for other things to be said as well. Shlomo, how much more time for our presentation?
That's up to you. I mean, I think Rushain said you were going to talk about part 2, so I think 10-20 minutes for that definitely can work.
Okay, good. So maybe before part 2, I'll just add one more thought about part 1, and that's our fascination with what we suggest as a new reading for verse 7:172, the verse of the covenant. So I only learned. We were reading the verses that talk about testimony together, like I told you in Chavruta, and we ran across this verse, and I told Rushain, "Hey, this is a Jewish covenantal text. I know this midrash," and he told me, "Oh no, it's not a Jewish covenantal context. It's a universal covenantal context. And we started digging into this verse, which strikingly comes one verse after the mention of the Sinaitic covenant, right? So 7:171 mentions Mount Sinai being lifted above the people in reference to the rabbinic homily about Kafalim Har Kegigit, how God has raised the mountain of Sinai on the people and actually forced them to accept the terms of the biblical covenant. So following from that, the Quran then goes on to talk about an instance, an event where the descendants of the people, all their offsprings that have not yet been born, are also there present and part of the covenant. And strikingly, there is a rabbinic midrash that says the exact same thing about the covenant of Sinai. And it is also occupied by a very similar theological concern as the Quran, and that is, how come everybody is committed to the covenant if they were not there, if they were not party, if they were not born where the covenant was made in the context of the Bible? And for the Quran too, this primordial, if you want, event is necessary for the theological stance that says everybody is committed to the covenant. All people were there, all people were part of it, even if it was in this primordial level when they were only souls and not yet people. So this is just another example of other verses. And the thing that also strikes us is the multiplicity of contexts where this this terminology of bearing witness is used specifically in the context of the Jewish covenant. So it's much of the polemics against the Jews is to say, how can you disbelieve? How can you not follow the divine command? You bore witness. You were witnesses. And now we understand the rhetoric of this accusation, of this claim anew, because, well, previous interpretations would say, you saw things, right? You saw all kinds of things. How can you disbelieve? You should believe what you've seen, right? You were witness to God's revelation, or to the God's miracles, or to God's intervention in history, etc., etc. How can you disbelieve? According to our reading, the accusation is actually different. It says you cannot turn your backs on what you already undertook upon yourselves. You committed yourselves through the covenant. You were witnesses in the sense that you swore, you took the oath to obey. And now how can you violate that? And this reproach that the Quran repeatedly addresses the Jews actually echoes quite nicely the reproach of biblical prophets against the Jews themselves. They're telling them, you are subject to the covenant. You ought to follow the covenant. You cannot turn your backs on God. And Muhammad is, in that sense, or the prophet of the Quran, in that sense, really resonates very deeply with the biblical theme of the reproach for violation of the covenant. And we can now say something about part 2, or Rushain, you wanted to say something else about that?
No, I think that's very beautifully explained, and I hope you all understand the deep implications of this argument, right? I mean, first of all, at one level, it helps us understand this repetition of wa antum tashhadun, you are witnesses, you are witnesses. What does this actually mean? It really grounds the Quran more specifically in its context, and actually maps on much better to these verses of the Quran in which it appears, right? When it's speaking about the ayat that it'll constantly call in these contexts, it's not simply the signs of God, but really the verses of God. And in other verses, it'll say these are the verses that are recited, right? So it helps provide us with a more concrete translation that makes sense of really the import and significance of this accusation, right? They're not just observing things, but they're really bound by this oath of fealty that is being broken, right? And of course, even the idea of the ahad, the covenant being broken, is also used throughout the Quran, just as with the Bible. And just one thing that actually occurred to me now is that Orit had explained to me before how this problem of this covenantal extension to those who are not present, it presented itself in the later rabbinic midrash with individualistic trends, right? And so what's fascinating is that's precisely in line with the Quran, which also represents this move towards a kind of moral individualism within broader late antique society, right? So it would make so much sense that the same sort of theological problems as this broader rabbinic tradition present themselves to the Quran, and it seeks to resolve them in its own way, or in ways that build on this biblical precedent. So at a terminological level, it's clear, right? Ala anfusihim, bear witness against yourself or upon yourself. Even the same ambiguity of language seems to be present. But then also at the theological level, there's this deep recognition of that polemical language of the Bible, as Orit mentioned. So I think maybe you can show them the share screen with this document to just show some of the verses. So basically, I'll let Orit speak a little bit about the understanding of these verses, but we've talked about in this context of taking of oath, the undertaking of the oath, right? Of what does it mean to say, I bear witness, or you have to bear witness, therefore bear witness in the command form, right? That is for the subject who's undertaking the oath, whether it's the Jews or whether it's the Muslim who now has to attest their oath of fealty to God. But the oath has a sort of two-part structure, right? So there's, as Orit mentioned in the beginning, there's always the enforcer of the oath, right? There's the imposition of the oath, right? It's not simply that they're taking it out of nowhere, but that they are sort of required to do so. So what we recognize actually from very early on is that there is this sort of mechanical process, one might say, to the oath structure, right? So there are different levels to the oath structure. So one thing we haven't talked about in this article, and it might come up in the questions very naturally, is that prophets are called witnesses in the Quran, and that there's this language around you were sent as witnesses against something, so on and so forth, right? We argue with the second part that the imposition level of the oath is also elaborated throughout the Quran through the mechanism of sort of God imposing the oath through a prophet who is sent, and then also the community, which also in some instances is called a witness in the Quran, a shaheed. So here are some examples of verses we can just show you. There's also, and I think one good thing we'll also allude to here is that we can expand the covenantal lexicon even broader, right? So there are other terms in the Quran which seem to be attached to the act of bearing witness, which actually help elaborate what's going on with bearing witness, right? Because it's so vague. What does it mean to bear witness? But there are these other terms attached, which actually sort of give an explanation or elucidation of the action of bearing witness. And this is something, we haven't written this part of the article yet, but this is some examples that I think Orit, if you're happy to do so, she'll give you some Quranic and also biblical examples of these.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Rushain. So just to put the second part in context, so when we went over the uses of witnesses and the terminology of witnessing and bearing witness in the Quran, we actually, one of our goals was to classify. We have about 160 occasions of the root in the Quran, and we tried to classify the different uses that we found. So not all, about close to 80 or a little bit less than that are maybe we could do with the standard or the legal common interpretation meaning of, like, to see something and then to report it, to report some kind of knowledge, etc., etc. And the rest are actually all belong to the theological sphere. But within this theological sphere, there are a couple of different usages of the same verbs, okay? But they are still very distinct. It sounds confusing to say I am a witness or I bear witness can mean two things, or more than two things really, but for our purposes, let's focus on these two. One thing is I take the oath. The other thing is I make you take the oath. I impose the oath on you. It sounds like it's contradictory, like which one is it? Are you is the witness taking the oath, or is the witness imposing the oath? But given this the idea of witnessing and testimony is so ancient and so developed in so many of these very early texts in the Bible, in this many books, and in the post-biblical and in the rabbinic interpretation, the Quran has a lot to work with. When it comes to the Quran, it has a lot to work with, and it develops these independent or not independent, they're very interconnected, but still very distinct branches of the use of bearing witness in those two complementary senses. One is to take the oath of the covenant, and the other is to impose the oath of the covenant. And also the Quran acknowledges the rhetorical potential of this double meaning and uses it to its full in a lot of literally beautiful verses, which we will not show you here now. But I just want to show you very briefly, where does the idea of a witness as one imposing the oath comes from? And let us be, it will be very brief. We'll begin with 48:8, a verse that describes Muhammad is coming as a witness, Shahid, as a bearer of glad tidings, Mubashir, and as a warner, Nadir. So being a witness is here connected to these two other things, promising and warning. And remember what I told you about the original structure of the oath. You undertake something and some commitment, and then you also undertake with it a possible punishment if you violate, from which you are warned, and a possible reward for fulfillment, for which you get a promise, a promise for good tidings, for glad tidings, a promise for b'sorah, mubashir, is really parallel to this Hebrew b'sorah. And another thing about the word warner, nadir, which actually has the context of another a vow, also a oath related background. So bearing witness, when the prophet comes forward with his message, telling the potential believers how they will be punished if they don't follow God's ways, or how they will be rewarded if they do follow God's ways. He's called a witness, invoking the context of promises and warnings that accompany the biblical oath standardly. 5:19 is another example where the same terminology is used with reference to the biblical prophets. Muhammad is reminding the people of the book that they've already had people that the bearers of glad tidings and warners. That's what the Jewish prophets did as well. Now, when we go to the Bible and we look at what these prophets actually did, we find the terminology of witnessing quite literally there. Whereas in the case of witnesses is taking the oath, this is a very unusual use in the context of Joshua 24. In case of imposing the oath, it's a rather usual and common usage to say that when you impose the oath on somebody, you are, we would say today, in the later Hebrew, the same word is used in the sense of bearing witness. In the days of the Quran, this is already the meaning, bearing witness. But in its original biblical language, the meaning is summoning witness. But the verb is the same. It's leha'id, he'id. So you say you are bearing witness at the people to do right, to follow God's covenant, to fulfill the covenantal undertakings, and warning them that if they violate that, they will be punished. So here is Jeremiah telling the people in source number 3, and the Lord said to me, proclaim all these words in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. Hear the words of this covenant and do them, for I solemnly warned your fathers when I brought them out of Egypt. Warned is here literally ha'ed ha'idoti, I bore witness against your fathers. Even to this day, saying, obey my voice. Yet they did not obey or incline their ear, but everyone walked in the stubbornness of their evil hearts. So the prophet is bearing witness against the people. Again, the meaning, the biblical meaning of this same verb is slightly different. But when Muhammad is reading this verse, this is its meaning. Because the word leha'id already comes to mean to bear witness. And this is how the prophet is reminding the people of the covenantal commitments and imposing it upon them. Now, the last source I want to show you is from Jubilees, chapter 1. This is an intermediate text between the Bible and the Quran, which actually echoes another verse, a biblical verse from Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah, that is quoted here. In Nehemiah, we find the same usage that I just showed you in Jeremiah. The prophets are described as bearing witness against the people, and they were killed by the people who didn't want to listen. They didn't want to hear them. You can see that only the verb is used. They bore witness against the people. We don't have the prophets. The prophets themselves are not called witnesses. But the next step, to call the person who does bear witness, to call him a witness, it's a very small, but conceptually very small and immediate move. And we find this move already in Jubilees, here in verse 11, and I will send witnesses, edim, unto them, that I may bear witness against them, leha'id bahem. Yes, God is sending prophets to whom he calls witnesses to bear witness against the people. So we see that Jubilees already makes this first move from the biblical language. In the Bible, we find it that you say prophets bear witness, or the prophets testify, or however you want to translate this verb. Nevi'im me'idim. The Jubilees already makes the second step to call these people that bear witness, to call them witness. And this is exactly what we find in the Quran, where the Prophet Muhammad is described as the one who is a witness, who is the bearer of glad tidings and the warner. He brings the covenantal commitment. He requires of the people to follow that commitment, and he promises reward and threatens with punishment, as in the original structure of oath that we find in the Bible, and that is really actually echoed here. So this is basically the argument that we will present in part 2 of the project, and thus we will divide the theological uses of the shahada, of the idea of bearing witness in the Quran, into these 2 large families. One where bearing witness would mean accept the oath upon yourself, swear the oath, the covenantal oath, and the other where it describes the imposition of the oath, the bringing of the divine message as a covenantal framework, as a covenantal oath to the people who are being subjected to it. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Okay, thank you very much, Rushain and Orit. I wanted to open by thanking both of our presenters for this very interesting paper. As you read and heard, it explores the roles of witnessing as connected to oaths and to covenant, and then argues for this as the biblical backdrop for the verb shahida in the Quran. It closes with a specific and compelling argument for a parallel between Joshua 24, Testament of Levi 19, and the Quran in 2 passages. And then we heard the new and promising research for part 2 of this paper. As noted, I'll start us off by asking a few questions before turning to the audience. And as I just put in the chat, please post a period in the chat to reserve a spot in line for asking a question. I'll call on people in order. And if you prefer that I read your question for whatever reason, feel free to just send it to me directly by chat. So as mentioned earlier, this paper is the opening talk, the opening public talk for the overall research project on co-produced religion. And as Katarina Hayden and David Nierenberg put it in the conceptual paper around this, co-production assumes that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, in this case, primarily Jewish traditions and Islam, from their formation and forward, are always in conversation with one another and regularly influence one another. This takes place not just through direct borrowing or appropriation, but also in less obvious ways, including parallel development or even cases of polemic. So Rushain and Orit, I'd like to open by inviting you to reflect on the ways in which this project, this paper, might demonstrate instances or an instance of Jewish-Muslim co-production.
Rushain, I don't see you. Do you want to go or should I go?
I think go ahead. I'll follow.
Okay. Okay, so what we see in the paper in part 1 and what we've distributed is that there is a theological framework of the covenant for the Bible, and there is the terminology for different reasons, which if people want, we can discuss. We have this one occurrence of this theological framework taking this unique aspect of calling the people as witnesses against themselves in the making of the covenant, where in every other occasion it would be invoking God as a witness or invoking heaven and earth as a witness, as witnesses, which is really a remnant of an age where heaven and earth were divine entities or represented divinities from the ancient world. We have the parallels from other Near Eastern sources to this oath structure. But here, no, it's not the heaven and earth, and it's not God, and it's not other divinities. It's the people themselves. It's almost an accident in the Bible, I would say. There is maybe one other text that echoes that. That's Isaiah 43, where the children of Israel, it's a very famous story, famous verse, very, very important for Christianity as well. The people of Israel are called witnesses. You are my witnesses. And although this verse was traditionally understood as some kind of a trial scene, some kind of a divine trial scene where God is on trial and the different witnesses come forward, testify in favor of God or for God, I think this reading should be revisited. But let's say I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, then Joshua 24 is really the one and only place in the Bible where witnesses will be the people taking the oath. And the Quran, by remaining very faithful to the covenantal structure, actually reworks the entire terminology and the entire a structure by saying a person takes the covenantal oath by bearing witness. It's both a very accurate reading and also a very wrong reading, in parentheses I'm saying. You would say, if we were here in the debate of, is it a genuine reading, is it not, or is it missing something? It's both, right? It's not a biblical reading, but then it cannot be understood without the biblical substructure and the underpinnings. And with a lot of mediation of post-biblical sources and rabbinic interpretation, the Quran comes up with this remarkable notion and then expands it and develops it to. He also makes the connection. The text also makes the connection between the witness is the one taking the oath, as the witness is the one imposing the oath. So you can see the creative potential of what's happening here with adopting the terminology of witnessing, which has its origin in Jewish thought, and the theological structure has its origin in Jewish thought, but then it's reinvented. It's made anew. So it's both familiar and strange. It's both the same thing and a totally new thing in a very deep way. And both aspects are true. So I find this to be a very strong example of co-production.
Yeah, I'll just add. First of all, I think both the same thing and a totally new thing is a great way to describe Islam and the Quran. It's just you constantly encounter that, right? These continuities and discontinuities. But yeah, on a broader note, I think that one interesting thing that we encountered when we were, dividing up how to figure out this these various forms and employments of this usage of shahida is. We had the Jewish context and the non-Jewish context, right? So very clearly you can see where it's polemicizing with the Jews, right? Saying, why have you not you've borne witness to this covenant, why are you breaking it now? But again, to go back to this original point that I had made, right, it has often been reduced to this polemical aspect, right? But what we found is that it's scattered throughout the Quran in very non-Jewish context, non-Israelite context, right? So it's a fascinating sort of co-production of sort of polemics and like a creative updating of a previous this sort of theological notion or an expansion, as Orit described it, right? So in some instances it is obviously very much used as a polemic, and I'm mentioning the term polemic because you had raised in your question, and it's of course the most important one of the most important elements of co-production, right? It's I mentioned this at the beginning, right? The polemical construction of theology. It doesn't emerge from nowhere, right? You're speaking to an audience. There are claims being made by Jewish actors. There are claims being made by, syncretic pagan actors. So there's so many different people who have already claimed certain ideas about God and so on and so forth. So you can't simply come with new ideas or you'll be rejected, right? So the Quran here is very much engaging in a polemic. But then, as Orit says, it's really to reduce it to a polemic is not to not understand how it goes beyond that, right? By expanding it into these various non-Jewish contexts, and not simply by scattering the term and having some sort of vague theological resonance, but actually centralizing it. And as Orit said, right, it's sort of a rereading of what the covenant is, or a radical understanding of what that covenant entails. And that's really what the Quran often does, right? It says, oh, you've gotten this idea wrong, and we've gotten it right, and here you go, right? This is a misunderstanding of the biblical scriptures, so on and so forth, right? So here we're simply getting another instance, a more, I would say, fundamental instantiation of this Quranic process by which it polemicizes and updates and sort of makes a very significant claim about central biblical notions, and makes that a sort of part of a new theology, a new religious identity, which again is not so new because it's claiming originality, right? It's always saying it's going back to what was actually true, right? And that goes back to the question of genuine or not, right? It's claiming a genuineness, but there's obviously different ways of reading these texts. So again, that comes back to this idea of the midrashic nature, right? It's saying, well, this is our reading of the text, and we're going to say it's the true one. And then obviously it expands it into something much more. So yeah, there's a very clear sense of the co-production of religion. I think we both believe that.
All right, thank you very much for that. I think I was planning on asking you a question about the process of putting together this article, but I think you described it so nicely at the beginning, and Orit's formulation of chavruta, which I can certainly identify with. I think I've had some similar experiences as part of this project already. Thank you for that, and I'll skip that and just ask one more question before turning to the group as a whole, and people are already lining up in the chat. So in your introductory section of the paper, and Rushain, I think, mentioned this as well in his remarks, you note that there are two approaches to studying the Quran in its biblical context, where some scholars dedicate themselves to the more deconstructive, critical historical task of linking the appearances of narratives and ideas in the Quran to their broader circulation in late antiquity, while another group or another approach is to take a literary approach, which attempts to reconstruct the Quran's original message in light of its appropriation, recasting, and critique in various biblical traditions. And you say that you take the latter approach primarily. Although, as evidenced by your use, let's say, of the Testament of Levi passage and several midrashim, and I think in part 2 of the paper also, it's clear that the paper is also looking to create a trajectory for how these biblical traditions make their way to the Quran. And of course, this makes a good deal of sense, given that these biblical traditions are more than a millennium, some of them before the writing of the Quran, and even the Testament of Levi is a good 800 years before. So in light of this, I wanted to ask whether you thought there are other sources that might be helpful in bridging that chronological gap. Just to give a couple of examples of what I think might be relevant. So as we heard and read, the paper cites a variety of midrashic sources retelling biblical stories of covenant, and certainly those are relevant. But I was wondering, in light of the discussion on the relationship between bearing witness and swearing in the Quran, which was discussed at length, have you considered legal Talmudic sources on that question? So, for example, there's the concept of Shvuat Ha'idut, the oath, the oath of testimony, or the hortatory oath. There's a whole chapter about this in the Mishnah and the Talmud. It explicates Leviticus 5 and passages in Proverbs. So there's a whole tradition on that. And how might that be relevant to the relationship between promising and testifying, for example? Or in a different vein, what role might Christian and/or Syriac sources on oaths, witnessing, and promises contribute to our discussion? So just to give one specific example, if we're talking about the shahada and the verb, all the verbs relating to shahida, so what connection do you see, if any, between that term and the Syriac/Aramaic term sahada or sahaduta, witness or testimony? So as you note in the paper, the Quran has a wide knowledge of Jewish ideas in general and intimate familiarity with Jewish and Christian oral traditions. How might engaging with some of those materials, either those I mentioned or other ones, either strengthen or nuance your arguments?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges of this kind of work, where we've started off from the biblical intuitions, the resonances, and like Rushain describes it, we've just read the text and said, hey, it says the same thing. So now the challenge says, all right, the challenge is, how do we bridge the gap? What happened in the middle, and how? And it's a very good question, and a good scholarship has to account for this question. And we just feel that we are in the stage that we have to put the general framework out there. Definitely, it would need to be nuanced, and all the texts that you mentioned are relevant, and probably many others. They all function in the same general framework. So the Christian Aramaic texts use Sahid in the same way, or in an interlinked way to this net of ideas that we find in the Jewish context. In a different paper, I've shown that the New Testament clearly shows resonances of this, some of the biblical notions of bearing witness, mostly connected to part 2 of the project. And of course, it continues well into the post-biblical Christian materials. There's also another very crucial context, and that is of you help me, Rushain, what's the word for martyr?
Yeah, shaheed and shuhada. Yeah.
Yeah. So martyrdom is obviously also connected and is part of this pact. of this. But we will, the way we go in our project is to first lay down the argument for the general semantic connection, and we will start filling the bits from there. There's much work to be done.
Yeah, I'll just add that yeah, when I had written that this typology, I didn't mean to suggest it was mutually exclusive either, right? I think that there is a division of labor, so to speak, or perhaps a kind of chronological division for. And I think it's really the problem of the proof is in the pudding, right? I mean, that's how I would present it. So we see the results of what these connections can do in helping us understand the Quranic text, helping us make sense of hermeneutical problems, which previously could not be made sense of, right? So it suggests very strongly that there is this deep familiarity. And obviously there are so many other examples of familiarity with Genesis Rabbah and other Talmudic texts, even from the Meccan period, right? So the question of circulation of text is something that, I mean, first of all, there's a lot more work being done on this now, and hopefully there'll be more work done later that will be able to substantiate these connections. But I do think, yeah, first step is to start with the Quran, start with the problems, and then sort of elaborate from there to make this sort of broader web, which I think we're building, right? These web of connections and speculative possible connections with strong basis, given the overlap in meaning, given the very clear polemical context in which the Quran emerges, right? And then from there to sort of test these out and to see, obviously there's the oral Torah tradition, which is, Muhammad would have been familiar with and would have been present in that community. And that's very clear, right? And then obviously the question of textual transmission is an important one as well. Obviously highly debated in the subfield of Quranic and early Islamic studies. Yeah, we don't have an answer for that, but I do think that we'll slowly make our way there over time, and that it's not one that should be pushed aside. It should be front and center, as you suggest, but it's something that requires a sort of evolution in this kind of inquiry.
Okay, thank you for your answers, and we now turn to everyone else's questions. And the line we have so far is David Nierenberg, Fred, David Gyllenhaal, and Yisrael. Everyone else is welcome to add their periods to the list, but we'll start with David Nierenberg.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry, I don't mean to jump in the front of the line, except that I'm going to sign off in 3 minutes, and so I want to thank you for this really wonderful presentation, and just comment on the relationship between polemic and creativity, which I think, Rushain, you're saying we don't want to reduce it to polemic. There's something creative, and maybe we need to think the two as themselves so intimately inseparable that we should call them something like co-produced. And one way to think of that would be what's the role of the history of this of some of the New Testament presentations of the Jews in what we're seeing here, because I think there's a path dependency to the kind of creativity that happens. And another way to do it, even just interQuranically, might be to think why the Quran really wants to have it both ways with the Jews. In the first time the story of Mount Sinai is invoked in Surah 2, the Jews don't take the oath. They say, we hear and we disobey. So why is this relationship of the Jews to the covenant, whether it's one of oath breaking or one of oath refusal, so central? That itself is a question that might help stage the polemic and creativity thing. But this is just a way of saying, you've ushered us into a really marvelous world, and I wish I could stay for the rest of the discussion. And I can't thank you enough, but I will be writing to you with thanks and observations.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. It was
Thank
really
you, David.
an honor to be able to join you all, and this is really great food for thought. I think that that's precisely the next step we want to take, is to think more about that covenantal context in a very concrete contextual sense, because that's the way in which we'll be able to elaborate the dynamic, this kind of polemical creativity, this co-production. That's the thing we wanted to set off to the side, to first start with the philology, begin with the terms, and then by the end, okay, say, well, what do we have here? What is the broader point of the covenant being made? And then how do we situate it vis-a-vis all of these, ups and downs vis-a-vis the Jewish community? in that early emerging community. So that's a wonderful point, and I'm sure that's one that we'll take into account. And that's the thing we've talked about, right? We haven't really done this analysis in light of the Quranic, more concrete Quranic context. That's something we have to move on to later, thinking about in which way the Shahada appears in some instances, in some surahs and not in others, obviously diachronically speaking as well. So that's something we'll move on to later. But thank you again.
Thank you, David.
Okay, Fred.
Well, it's my turn to say thank you to both Orit and Rushain for what I found to be a really interesting and wonderful paper. It got me thinking about things I hadn't thought I was going to think about. It was really quite fascinating. And I think your argument is a very strong one. What I want to comment on or raise is the question of, I guess we could say, to move this partially into the realm of the sociological rather than the theological. It seems to me that when we speak about someone bearing witness, it's explicitly a public matter. The whole idea is to make a statement publicly for the public to hear. And particularly when we talk about how Muslims say the Shahada, when they bear witness, they say, you know, God and Muhammad is the apostle. I believe there's no God but God and the apostle. Muhammad is the apostle of God. This is a statement that affirms publicly their membership in a community. So it's a very public act, and it has that function to it. It doesn't matter what the theological basis of the community is. You're saying you're a member of a particular community by bearing witness. Then to the question of things like vows and oaths. A vow, it seems to me, can be a personal, private thing. You can vow to yourself, oh, I'm going to do this, or I'm never going to do this again, or something, but you don't have to tell anybody, right? If you want to make it public, then you can say it publicly. And if you invoke God or the world or someone, then it becomes an oath. So the oath is kind of the form in which you publicly state a vow, right? And you can invoke someone to be your witness, as is frequently the case, by God. God is my witness. I'm never going to do this again, or I am going to do this, whatever it might be. So this question of the public role in this, I think, is something that I'm not quite sure where my thinking is taking me here or will take you here. But it seems to me that there are several different ways then of bearing witness, and you've talked about them. Bearing witness against yourself or to yourself or something you have done is different from when you are witness to what someone else may have done. And I think those may need to be said in your presentation. I don't know. And there was one other thought that I was coming up to. What was it? It got away from me and I haven't written it down. Anyway, I mean, you know, one of the things is when you invoke God as your witness, can God ever come forth and bear witness against you? Well, actually, probably not. He's not going to appear. The prophets will say that we are sent by God to bear witness against you people who aren't behaving, but that's still not God himself or herself coming forth to bear witness. So when you invoke God as your witness, it's kind of not clear exactly how that's going to happen. It seems more to be a public statement of the seriousness of your vow that you invoke God as a witness that way. I will stop here. My thoughts are, thank you very much for the paper.
Thank you, Fred. I'll speak a little bit about that's okay, Orit, and then we can. Yeah. Thank you, Fred, so much, and I'm very happy to hear that you were convinced by our argument, and it's a wonderful question, and I think this is something we're still thinking about a lot. So one relevant passage to your question is two verses from chapter 6, Surah Al-An'am, 6:19, I believe, and 6:130, if I remember correctly, where the order is given to the Prophet, right, when the Meccans, they swear about their other gods, La tashhad ma'akum, right? Do not bear witness with them. Do not bear witness with them. And it's in two different instances from the late Meccan period already, right? So this is before the encounter even with the the Jewish community. And it's an interesting usage, and we had mentioned it only briefly, I think, in the beginning of the article, to show that, you know, sometimes it says you join through bearing witness, but then it sometimes says you sort of make a negative, right? It's the only two usages, I think, where it's negative. Do not bear witness, ma'ahum, right? Like with them. So the public nature is very clear here, right? It's sort of a differentiation, active differentiation from that community. And obviously there's a clear resonance with the broader socio-political context, right? Andrew Marsham talks about, essentially, I mean, in this Arabian society, the oaths are like the basis for the basis for international relations at that time, right? I mean, it's what binds tribes together, what binds alliances together. So there's obviously a great public significance to the act of swearing by various deities' names and not doing so, and the radical nature of not doing so. And when you read verses like that, you see the development of a community in not only theologically breaking from previous acts of recognition of various deities, but also a public act of breaking away, politically speaking, from a common alliance with that community. So I remember in the earlier redaction of the paper, and we're rethinking about how to think about this idea, especially in the diachronic context, of the development from the Meccan to Medinan context. It's this deep intertwinement between the political and the theological in this world, right? You can't really separate the two. And that's really why, I mean, that helps us even understand the theological significance. Why is the oath structure, the legal structure of the oath, so central? Why is it made the kind of central theological concept in the Quran? I mean, it has that deep sort of existential and political significance as well. This is what if you're bound by it, you can't break your oaths, right? You have to hold to them, or else you're nothing, right? And it'll create all this havoc. So it's a really important question, and I do think that we'll try to bring more of these reflections out as we bring the second part of the project to a conclusion, and try to think about the implications of what it really means to center the covenant and the structure of the oath to a new theology, so to speak. It's a really fascinating thing, and I think it will reveal a lot about, you know, the history of religions and late antique religions and the relationship to this ancient structure as well. Orit, you might have something to say about this as well.
I just want to comment on your last association about God bearing witness. What does it even mean that God bears witness? And just to go back to the original, what I call the basic oath structure, that is the inspiration for all these later developments. And that is when we invoke divinities as witnesses against ourselves. And the idea of bearing witness there is really not just, to hear what we said or to say something about that in any future forum. It's not like God is going to come and testify in front of some other judicial forum, hey, these people have violated their promise. That's not the idea. To be a witness in this context is to be a judge. God will punish you because he's going to see how you have violated your undertaking, and he will punish you. And this original notion of God as a witness, in the sense that God is a judge who punishes, is also evident in the Quran. In various contexts, we see God said to be a witness in that sense, of a judge, of a punishing judge. So the Quran really demonstrates a proliferation of usages, all linked to the basic oath structure, where we invoke God as the witness to the oath, to create an oath, to establish an oath. We invoke God as a witness to the oath because God is the judge. He will oversee the fulfillment of the oath. And God and others are called witnesses when imposing the oath, because the reasons that we explain in parts of the project, and the witnesses are the people taking the oath. So there's a multiplicity of meanings here connected. It's complicated, but it's coherent. That's what we argue.
Okay, David G.
Hey, thanks very much for the paper. I mean, I think the first thing to say about the paper is that sort of the cornerstone that you're building on, which I basically take as the chart on page 35 of the pre-circulated paper, the connection you've drawn out from Joshua 24 to the Testament of Levi, and then to Quran 381 and Quran 172, is extremely strong and compelling. And I don't think there's any denying that there's something really profound going on here. I think the question that arises for me is there's a lot of different arguments can be built on that cornerstone. And unless I'm misreading you, you're definitely making a pretty, I guess, maximalist structure, a pretty maximalist argument on the basis of that connection, which is that you've more or less unraveled most, if not all, uses of the verb shahada, of the root shahada in the Quran. And you make a strong case, but I think that certain things that wouldn't make me nervous in the context of a more minimalist case do start to make me nervous in the context of this very maximalist case. And the absence of any engagement with Syriac literature and the concept of martyrdom is definitely one of them. If you're making this sort of very strong argument that sort of you've kind of cracked the code, then I think you're sort of obliged to at least, I guess, either exercise or integrate the Christian legacy of martyrdom, and then also the way that Syriac literature uses the cognate root. I mean, because I went on Simtho and just slapped in the root just for sohto, just the noun form, and I got 424 hits. And one of the first things that I saw was a text that definitely dates to the 6th century saying, Mithin hanan sohte le korotso shlichoyo, which is, should we die, we shall be witnesses to al, the apostolic gospel. And the thing is that martyrdom is very tightly bound up with witnessing in a judicial context as statements of religious identity. It carries this whole legacy of associations of you go in front of the scary Roman magistrate, and even though he's being scary and he's telling you to say you're not a Christian, you go Cristiano si mi, or Cristiano no. So yeah, I guess my question would just sort of be, what's the plan for dealing with this Christian context and for the legacy of martyrdom? And is the plan to sort of exercise it or integrate it?
First of all, thank you very much for the question. You're absolutely right. And in another paper that I am writing about the origins of martyrdom and Maccabees 4, you already find, you don't have the word martyrdom there, but you have a martyrdom story, a martyrdom narrative. What you do have there is an oath being described in the terminology of witnessing or bearing witness. An oath that is sometimes described as testimony. We don't yet call these people martyrs, but it's already there. So clearly the martyrdom and the way it developed in later Christian sources is very much at the background. When we wrote the article, we wanted to separate the context of martyrdom from the theological, everyday, mundane declaration of faith, of the Muslim declaration of faith. We thought it would be more simple not to, dig in, put in all this very complicated context into the conversation, but we clearly see the downside of having it being missing out. And as you see, the article is not short the way it is. It's already almost 40 pages, and it's only part 1. When we say we cracked everything, we mean to say we cracked not everything, but that portion where bearing witness functions in the sense of taking an oath. There are other usages which we, in a planned book project, we want to refer to all of them, and the others are not dependent on that, on Joshua 24. The Joshua 24 is just the basis for this family of verses. So it's a big challenge how to manage this size of a project, and maybe we did a wrong choice to avoid the martyrdom context in this paper, but this is something we definitely need to think about.
Yeah, just thank you for the question. It's a wonderful one, and I think it's something we will definitely be taking into account. And neither preliminarily speaking by way of exercising or incorporating it, but to check what the sources are saying and see how it maps onto our Quran, especially because it's very clear that so much of the Quran's biblical understanding is mediated by that Syriac, for example, conceptions of various narratives related to Joseph or whoever, right? So it's very clear that there is influence there, and it's clear that it helps us make sense of so many of the biblical engagements in the Quran. So it's something we will definitely keep take into account, and also the martyrdom question, which is, I think, is a bit complicated in the Quranic context. Obviously, there's reference to martyrdom. Even though the use of shaheed, though, is still ambiguous with reference to it. Obviously, in the early period, it becomes very standard. So it's a big question, I think. And I think, yeah, in the long-term project, it's one we will definitely consider. It's unavoidable, really. So thank you for bringing our attention to it, and also for the reference. It's very interesting.
Okay, Yisrael, and I'll just say for the remaining questions, if people can keep the questions and maybe also the answers a bit shorter, so we can try to get everyone in by 12:30.
We can't hear you, Israel. You're muted.
Sarah, you're muted.
Here I am. Now you hear me?
Yeah.
No?
Yes,
Oh,
we do.
great. So
Go ahead.
I'll try to be short. First of all, thanks for the great lecture, great paper. And my question is actually a follow-up to David's. And I wish to take you, Orit, to your previous profession and your practice as a lawyer. Because if I understand correctly, in terms of the legal procedure, a witness should be an external party, a third party. He is not, or she is not part of the relationship between the two legal parties. And indeed, this is how it appears, according to what we learn from you in the Bible. You mentioned Nehemiah, and you mentioned Jeremiah, where the fathers are the witnesses, or the prophets, or in Deuteronomy 32, the heaven and the earth are the witness, or in Job, I don't remember the chapter, when again the witness are the sky, is the sky. So according to this idea, to say I bear witness sounds weird. I admit I never thought about that. And now, after hearing you talk, I think I raised the assumption that it is, in fact, as you said, should be probably reflects a late development, as we find in the Quran. But we find it also in Christianity. And here, and this is, as David mentioned, I think it's worth to think about the terms of the martyr and who testify by death to their faith, and of course the shaheed. But to think that in Judaism we don't use any parallel term, but instead Judaism use the concept of Kiddush Hashem, not testimony. So perhaps the link between the biblical tradition and the Quran is to be found in Christianity, in the Christian concept of martyrdom.
And just because we have 2 more questions now, I think maybe we'll have the remaining people online ask their questions, and then with whatever remaining time, Orit and Rushain can respond. Sorry for the switch, but so much excitement and so many questions. So we'll have Sarah, then Maria, Paul, and Jonathan.
Okay, thank you, Shlomo. First, thank you both so much for your honestly quite fascinating presentation. I was particularly excited to hear about it because I myself work on the continuity of Ishhad frameworks across Jewish and Islamic loan documents and debt acknowledgements. So I was excited to hear your insights on this topic. My two questions are, excuse my voice, it's a little scratchy today. I have two questions. The first is, I was wondering if you had both had a chance to kind of explore extra religious social contexts and kind of examining the continuity of aspects of the practice of oath taking between those extra religious social contexts and kind of this more religious / connected to the divine context of oath taking that you're looking at. The second question is, I think Rushain, you mentioned this briefly at the beginning, but do you also notice any continuity in terms of the gendered element of oath taking that I'm very familiar with in an Islamic context, but I'm less familiar with in other contexts?
Okay, Maria.
Okay, thank you. So some of my questions were already asked and answered, so I'm just gonna actually tag on to what Sarah said about the what you call the extra religious aspects. So what I found interesting was I think in the middle of the paper, and I think Rushain, you also mentioned in one of your answers, you said that a lot of the similarities in both the Hebrew and the Bible and the Quran have the similarities of the Quran also with political treaties and alliances. So I'm wondering about those contexts and how so as the standard vocabulary for the religious notions of the covenant. So I'm interested in those contexts. And also what I'm wondering a little bit about is the ambition. So when I read the paper, and I enjoyed it a lot, and also your this conversation, the presentation as well. And what I understood is that you're giving us a reading of semantic similarities. I think you call it the general semantic connections at some point, or this literary formula of similarities in these two texts. And I'm wondering what the ambition is for that similarity. And at this point, it seems like they're very high ambitions, and I'm wondering if that is a bit risky in setting the ambitions to crack a code or what you want to, because showing similarities is not so much proven this intertextuality, specifically if there is a millennia in between. Right, so I would very much enjoy this maybe mid-step along the way, or maybe be taken on the hand a little bit more. Thank you.
Paul.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Rushain and Orit. First of all, I was wondering if you were aware of an article that was written in 2008 by Dirk Hartwig, an article in German. Pardon my German, it's very bad, but it's called Der Urvertrag, ein rabbinischer Diskurs im Koran, which actually argues, reads the particular verse that you read, verse 172 of Surah 7, in light of rabbinic antecedents. So since I didn't see any reference to that in your paper, I was wondering if you were aware of that particular article. And also just, I mean, I was very convinced by the general argument of your paper. I found it very, very interesting and actually quite convincing. I did find the reading of verse 171 of Surah 7 quite problematic. And I just was wondering how you would respond to I mean, my general understanding of it, which contrarily to your very positive reading of it, I feel like, well, first of all, I mean, there is the verb nataqa, which is used at the very beginning of the verse, which when translated, of course, as raised, does not really translate the full meaning of it, because I mean, the actual meaning of this verb is to shake. So it's actually, it's a verse in which we have God shaking the Mount Sinai above the head of the Israelites. So I feel like it's definitely a menace. And this can, I think, to my mind, be complemented by the fact that the term dhulla, the Arabic dhulla, is also used in another place in the Quran in a very negative way as adab yawma dhulla, in describing one of the punishments reserved for the people of Shu'aib. So I think overall, I mean, there are a lot of arguments to say that this is definitely a verse, of menace. So that's pretty much it. Thank you again.
And for our final question, Jonathan.
Hi, Rushain and Orit. Thank you for your paper. And despite not having many expertise in what you were discussing, I found your paper both persuasive and clearly outlined. And I have, I guess, just a brief comment and maybe a suggestion that attempts to connect what Fred had brought up with the points that made by David Gyllenhaal and Professor Yuval, which is it seems to me that you're doing a couple of different things. One of which being outlining in a very persuasive way the conceptual links between different terminologies that people may not have connected as clearly before. Primarily the terms witness and oath as they appear in Quranic and Jewish text. And I think that opens up like a really interesting line of questions that being someone who studies early Christianity, to me, I can see having some deep resonances for the study of early Christianity as well. But I'm interested in Fred's point, which is what the sociological implications of this might be. And in thinking about that, one thing that stands out to me is that there's something distinct about the Shahada, that it's not kind of a quotidian oath, that's sort of an example of something that would have happened routinely, that it, for lack of a better term, it's a transcendental oath. And to me, it serves what I could describe as a totemic function, sociologically speaking, in that it's not visual, it's verbal, but it sort of stands as an icon that represents membership in a given community at a given time. And it sort of implicates processes of initiation into that group. And you have this really interesting passage in the beginning of your paper where you say the Shahada is the first thing that's whispered to someone when they're born into a Muslim community, and the last thing that they say when they die, which to me is very reminiscent of infant baptism and last rites in the Catholic tradition. And in light of that, I was sort of trying to think of what the Christian equivalent to this might be, and I don't find I think to try and connect this notion of the semantic links between witnessing and oath keeping would be pretty difficult to do with the notion of martyrdom in early Christianity. Not necessarily difficult. I think you just have to be really creative about the role that martyrs play in this process of confessions of oaths as processes of initiation into a group. But the one, I guess, counterpart or equivalent to the Shahada in early Christianity, one can argue, is the Nicene Creed. And there's really, and it doesn't really begin with this vocabulary of witnessing or oath keeping. It simply begins pistevomen, like we believe. But that got me interested in some of the derivatives of pisteo, and there are uses of pisteo that are utilized or that are linked to this notion of binding by oaths. And I can send you some of this, but so in Thucydides, for example, he uses the phrase "Pistun tina orchis," which means he bound him. But I mean, so pistis and pistova, man, like these notions of faith and believing have sort of a huge semantic range in Greek. But because things like the Nicene Creed, like these sort of like confessions, they're not merely theological, but that have some serious sociological consequences, and they become they function totemically in the sense that those who profess them are seen as being part of, for example, like the Nicene sect, as opposed to like the Arian sect or the Donatist sect. And so I'm thinking that there might be something there with pistevomen, or pisteo would be the first singular, or this notion of believing, where in Christianity it may not necessarily just be I guess professions of theological doctrines, but they have some of the same sociological consequences as oath taking or oath keeping in the passages that you're looking at.
So thank you, everyone. That was such a rich period of discussion and questions at the end. I don't think we even have time for Rushain and Orit to have the final word, but please join me in applauding, clapping, which can be a form of oath making in the medieval period, cross-religious. Applauding our two speakers, Rushain and Orit, for a wonderful paper and discussion, and looking forward to seeing everyone at future events. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed speaking with
you.
you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.